Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And depending on where in the world you are today, good morning, good afternoon, and even good evening. My name is Maricel Dicion, and I am with Women of Influence. Today, we are diving into a topic that affects nearly every woman in the workplace, whether she's conscious of it or not, and that is the authority gap. Joining us is Mary Ann Sieghart, who we had the pleasure of speaking with earlier this year about this same topic. Mary Ann is a journalist, broadcaster, consultant, and the author of the best-selling book, The Authority Gap, which explores why women are still routinely underestimated and interrupted, and what it will take to change that. Now, a special thank you to TENA Canada for partnering with us on this leadership series and for helping bring important, often overlooked conversations like this one to the forefront of workplace dialogue. As always, we encourage you, our valued audience members, to share your comments and questions in the comment box, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Now, without further ado, good morning or good afternoon, Mary Ann. Thank you for joining us again today.
You're welcome. It's good afternoon for me because I'm in London.
Wonderful. Well, let's kick things off. Now, you've said the authority gap is often invisible until you start looking for it. What are some of these subtle, everyday signals that tell a woman her authority is not being recognized?
Well, the manifestations of the authority gap are that women are much more likely to be underestimated, to be patronized, to be undervalued, to be mistaken for someone more junior, to be interrupted or talked over, as you mentioned earlier, not to be listened to or not to be heard, really, in groups, in meetings, to have their expertise constantly challenged, and if they're in a position of authority, to have that authority resisted by people. These are all manifestations of the authority gap. And I'm sure this will strike a chord with certainly with all the women dialing into this, because we've all experienced this during our career.
Mary Ann, when you joined us earlier this year to speak about this very same subject, you shared a personal experience you had with the authority gap. Would you mind sharing what happened and how you navigated that?
Gosh, there've been lots, so I can't remember which one I told you about last time. But I remember one, for instance, when I was at an international conference, and I was talking to a couple of other British delegates there, one of whom was a former head of our Foreign Office, that's like the American State Department, and the other one was a BBC foreign correspondent. And another delegate came over and looked straight at the men, completely ignored me, and said, "Can I ask you a question about British politics? Could Tony Blair ever make a comeback?" Now, I was the expert in British politics in that group. The other two men were experts in foreign affairs. So they both looked at me and I started answering the question. He couldn't even bring himself to look me in the eye. He was still looking at the men as I was answering. And then when I finished answering, he asked the men a follow-up question.
Oh my goodness.
I had to literally touch him on the shoulder to get him to look at me so that I could say, actually, I'm the expert on British politics in this group. I've written a column for the political column for the Times for years. This is my expertise.
Incredible. Given all your background and your expertise, still having to explain the validity of your perspective and your right to share it. Yeah. Now, from your research, Mary Ann, and interviews, what has most surprised you about how deep this credibility divide still runs, even in 2025?
I think what's most surprised me is that when I first started doing the research, I assumed that it was only a matter of time before the authority gap would naturally close, simply because younger men were much more progressive in their views than older men, and their antennae were acutely attuned to any suggestion of racism or homophobia, and I thought sexism. And I just wanted to speed this process up. And what I found to my dismay is that actually younger men are, if anything, more sexist in their attitudes than their fathers and their grandfathers, which really surprised me. So there they are, probably much more attuned to things like racism. When it comes to sexism, they actually have more traditional views on average. So there's a fascinating study called the Reykjavik Index, which looks at people, it asks people all over the world about how well they think women are suited to various big jobs, like being the CEO of a major corporation or running a country. And in almost every country, younger men now are less likely to say women are equally suited to these jobs than their father's generation, their grandfather's generation.
My goodness.
I know,
And
it's really surprising and alarming, isn't it?
given all the collective work that's being done to help women advance into more senior roles, to provide supports, to help address, unconscious bias, can we chat a little bit, if you're okay with it, as to why you think that is?
I think it's because there has been a big, so young men have seen young women actually overtake them educationally, at least. In almost every country now, more women than men go to university. Women outperform men at every level academically, from kindergarten to PhD. And so I think the men are starting to react against that with a sort of backlash of, feeling threatened by the relative, at least academic, if not necessarily employment success of women, and thinking, oh, this is all a bit too threatening. We've got to do something about it. And of course, they're encouraged in this by, by the manosphere. There's a lot of misogyny online these days, and that targets and grooms boys from, pre-teens, even via the games they're playing online. It's really quite scary what, how they're trying to burrow into these boys' brains, and the algorithms that platforms like TikTok, they will deliver misogynistic videos to teenage boys, even if they haven't asked for them.
Absolutely. Well, we could have a LinkedIn Live specifically on that topic, but let's save that for another day. I'd like to shift slightly to how the authority gap impacts women. Now, you've described a tightrope that women walk, being confident enough to be respected, but not so assertive that they're seen as unlikable. Now, how does that balancing act shape leadership styles and visibility?
Well, it's really difficult for women because a lot of the time men will say, well, if you spoke more confidently, people would listen more to what you said, and you just need to contribute more. You just need to sort of be more assertive and basically act more like men. If only it were that simple, would have solved this problem a long time ago. But the trouble is, first of all, because women are constantly subjected to this authority gap behavior, they're undermined, they're interrupted, they're ignored, their expertise is challenged. Every time that happens, women will experience a dent to their confidence. So their confidence is constantly being worn down in the first place. And people say, oh, why do women suffer imposter syndrome more than men? Well, it's because they're treated like imposters. If people are acting like the women don't have a right to be in the room, or they're not listening to what the women are saying, of course the women are going to feel more like imposters. So that's part of the problem, is that their confidence is being worn down. Another problem is that we are socialized to act much less confidently than boys. So boys are socialized to be self-promoting and boastful and competitive, and girls are socialized to be exactly the opposite: modest, self-deprecating, holding back, praising the team, not themselves, all that sort of thing. And so when we take that into the workplace, if we do act like that, the way we've been taught to act, then people just don't, we don't make an impact, right? And people take us at our word. So if we're being modest, they think, oh, well, she's not very good. But if we do start to behave like men and be quite self-promoting and competitive and assertive and confident, people tend to recoil and say, oh, God, she's quite aggressive, isn't she? Or abrasive or strident or bossy or overbearing. There's a very interesting study done of performance appraisals by a data analysis company called Textio, which found that women are 11 times more likely than men to be described as abrasive, and 7 times more likely to be described as opinionated. So men are confident, but women are abrasive. Men have opinions, but women are opinionated, and that's not the same thing, right? And so, yes, yeah, you might shake your head. So we have this tightrope to walk, as you say, between not being confident enough and therefore not being respected, or being confident enough and therefore not being liked. And the only way through this, and it is something that a lot of women in authority, senior women, have managed to learn, either consciously or unconsciously, is to overlay a huge layer of warmth onto your personality in order to mitigate the hostility that you might otherwise incur from being really good at your job and being confident and showing leadership and being assertive. And this may feel inauthentic to some women. it's something that men simply don't have to do, so it's a burden that women have to bear and men don't. It is actually effective on the whole. I mean, warmth in general makes you more human, it makes you more likable. But it's interesting, isn't it, that men in charge, men in leadership positions are not really expected to be likable. They're just expected to be good and strong and tough and dominant, whereas women have to be likable too. And it's quite exhausting and depleting.
I was just about to say, when you have to, code switch and, put on a
Yeah.
mask and take off a mask, depending on what room you're in and who you're speaking to, it absolutely can feel incredibly exhausting. I'm sure that many of our audience members can relate to that and bring up some examples of when they've had to layer on that extra bit of warmth to kind of, ease some potential tensions in a conversation, for example. Now, younger women often enter the workplace believing equity has already been achieved. Where are we seeing real progress, and where does the gap remain stubbornly wide?
Yeah, I mean, we all graduated from university, didn't we, thinking, oh, we're going to be fine. It's all right now. And, here I am at 64 thinking, don't think I got that one right. And it's true for my daughter's generation too. I think that employers are getting a lot more concerned about the fact that women's career progression is on average much slower than men's, and it is on average. And this is even before you have children. So there was one big study which looked at tens of thousands of performance assessments and found that on average, the women's performance appraisals were actually slightly better than the men's, but they were 14% less likely to be promoted. Okay. And a lot of these, so this was the first track, the first rung on the management ladder. So this was basically before childbearing years. Women are still not being promoted as fast as men. And when the researchers dug down, they found that the reason was that the men were deemed to have more potential than the women. Now, of course, potential is very subjective. Performance appraisal is quite objective. You look at what someone has done in the course of the year, but potential is just what are your expectations for them? And that becomes very subjective. And so the men were getting promoted on the incorrect assumption that they had more potential. And the reason I say incorrect was because this research was done longitudinally over several years, and they saw that the women's potential was actually as high as the men's, but they weren't being valued as much. So that's what's happening even for young women, I'm afraid, even young women now coming into the workforce. Where is it working well? I think, as I said earlier, employers are now understanding that there is a problem. What they don't really know is how to solve it. And that's what actually I'm now helping them to do with the Authority Gap Consultancy. Because what most of them tend to do is to throw all their time and energy and resources and effort into trying to fix the women, as if the women are somehow deficient. Mm-hmm. And so they send the women on these confidence building and empowerment and leadership courses to try to sort of bring them up to the same level as the men. But what happens is that they then come back to the workforce all confident and empowered and full of leadership ambition, only to be held back by exactly the same culture that was holding them back before. And if anything, they're even more annoyed now they're so confident and empowered. And so what we say is stop trying to fix the women. The women are fine. It's the culture actually that needs fixing. And crucially, that means involving the men. And, there's some fascinating BCG research, for instance, that shows that in businesses in which men are involved in gender diversity, 96% report progress compared with only 30% when the men aren't involved. So we're saying we've got to get men to join this conversation. It's really dramatic, the difference it makes.
Mary Ann, I'd like to talk more about organizational accountability, but before I get to that part of our discussion, I want to share a question that comes from our friends at TENA. Now, their goal is to help open up conversations surrounding our changing health and bodies as we age, and to help break stigma around issues like incontinence, perimenopause, and menopause. What role, if any, do these life and health changes impact a woman's confidence or her perception in the workplace? Do these life stage experiences widen the authority gap in your perspective?
It's very complicated. I mean, first of all, every woman's experience of menopause is different. My mother claims she didn't even really notice it. Lucky her. Other women find they have a huge drop in confidence and they have brain fog. They can't think clearly. They're exhausted. They're on edge. So it differs hugely from woman to woman. That's one thing I would say. Another thing is, now I feel quite conflicted about this, because on the one hand, I really do want people to understand what happens to women in the menopause and to make allowances for that. On the other hand, what worries me is that already women of childbearing age are being discriminated against. So from about 20 to your early 40s, there are employers who'll think either, oh, I won't hire her, or I won't promote her because she's going to go off and have children. They're not supposed to say that publicly, but they might well think it. If they're now going to think also from late 40s onwards, oh, she's going to be a pain because she's going to be going through the menopause, we'll only have about a window of 5 years of employability in between the two. So, yeah, I do feel conflicted about it.
It is it's a complex thing to navigate. But you brought up something before that question, which is the organizational responsibility and some of the work that you're doing with organizations to address the authority gap. Now, many companies equate representation with equity, but representation alone does not necessarily close the credibility gap. What else do you think needs to shift inside organizations? You mentioned culture. What is a culture that, I don't know if you can ever eliminate the authority gap, but lessens the impact of that or addresses it properly look like?
Yeah, so what you need is for everybody in the organization to know what it is and how it manifests itself, and to understand why this is actually impacting business performance. It's making the business or the organization perform less well than it otherwise would. Because basically, if you are not maximizing the potential, if you're only maximizing the potential of half your workforce, the men, then you're not going to be performing as well as you could. If the women aren't being listened to enough, are having their competence dismissed and their expertise dismissed, if they're not being included in meetings where they should be, if they're being mistaken for someone more junior and undervalued, all these things means they're not going to perform as well. They're going to be less engaged, they're going to be dispirited, they're going to be more likely to leave, and therefore the organization won't perform as well. So you need everyone in the organization to know what the authority gap is and how it manifests, and to understand why it's a bad thing for the organization as a whole, and how they will become better leaders if they actually manage their teams without any authority gap. So you've got to have the buy-in, right? But so that's engaging their heads. But what we then do is we engage their hearts, because all the research shows that the best way to mitigate unconscious bias, and this does mainly happen because of unconscious bias, is to engender empathy with the out-group. And in this context, the out-group is women. And so what we have to do is open men's eyes to the authority gap when it happens, but then crucially make them understand how terrible that makes the woman feel when it happens. So they then think, oh my God, I had no idea I was doing this, or I had no idea this was happening. And actually this is terrible. And it's not just bad for the business, but it's a really awful thing to happen. And I'm going to make sure I'm not contributing to it. I'm going to spot it when it happens. I'm going to intervene if I see it happening to someone else, and I'm going to try and prevent it in the first place. So that's what we do, is we open these men's eyes to what's going on. We help them feel how it would help them understand how it would feel if it happened to them. And then they become highly committed to doing something about it. With our last client, 96% of these mainly male senior leaders said they were now highly committed to using what they'd learned to close the authority gap there. And I thought, oh, fantastic.
That's incredible. Now, what does that look like? What does intervening in the moment look like? What does being an ally when it comes to addressing the authority gap in the moment look like?
Yeah, okay. So for instance, suppose you make a point at a meeting and none of the men take any notice, and 10 minutes later, one of the men makes exactly the same point and he gets all the credit for it. So there are two ways of intervening there. One is, when you first make the point, the ally can come in and say, oh yeah, I think that's a great idea, Maricel, I really think we should do that. So that actually stops the second part of the story happening in the first place, because you have been credited for your idea. But if that step has been missed, then when the man repeats your idea, your ally could say, oh yes, I completely agree. That's what Maricel said earlier, isn't it? Good for her. So, you've just got to spot it when it happens and give a helping hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't have to be contentious. It's a sponsoring comment in the moment. It doesn't have to be conflicting. Absolutely. Now,
or if you get into, I just interrupted you. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
But if you get interrupted, then the ally can say, "Oh, hang on, I'm really interested in what Maricel's saying here." Easy thing to do. No conflict, no aggression, just stepping in.
Absolutely. It really does start to your point. So I just want to summarize, it's about awareness. What is it? How does it show up? But also the human impact. So yes, it's not just the smart thing to do for the business. It's also the right thing to do because of how the authority gap impacts the person who's experiencing it. Now, you've written about how feedback and evaluation, let's get into that a little bit, often differ for men and women. How can organizations make recognition and advancement genuinely merit-based and remove the authority gap from this layer of a workplace evaluation?
Yes. So, well, first of all, linked to what I said earlier, make sure you're absolutely appraising on performance, not some subjective idea of future potential. Secondly, have a really close look at the adjectives you're using and whether they might tell you more about yourself than about the woman you're judging. So if you say that she's abrasive or aggressive or bossy, maybe that's simply because she's going against stereotype and it's making you feel uncomfortable. So you should always flip things around and ask yourself, would I have said that about a man behaving the same way? And if not, please don't use it. And another common pattern is that men are much more often described with words like outstanding, talented, brilliant. And women are much more often described with what are known as the grindstone adjectives like hardworking and conscientious and diligent.
Mm-hmm.
And again, look at those adjectives and think, would I have used them on a man? Or indeed, why am I not calling her brilliant and outstanding and talented?
I had to write some of those down. So it is, the words that you use, the adjectives that you use to describe a woman's performance might tell you more about yourself than about the woman. I just wanted to underscore these, and the grindstone adjectives, hardworking, strong work ethic, things like that. I have a question from the audience I'd like to bring up, and it's from Amanda. I'm trying to find it here. So many questions coming through. What happens if you do not have the ally or an ally to support you in the moments at your workplace? What would you do?
Well, I mean, you may have to stand up for yourself, and that is always harder because, quite often you don't want to be labeled tricky or difficult or oversensitive. So do it with a smile, use a bit of humor if you can. But if you don't have the courage to do that, and I don't blame you if you don't, because it may be you're in a difficult position, the other people are more senior, then have a quiet word with whoever was running the meeting afterwards and say, I don't know if you noticed, but, I raised this point first and didn't get the credit for it, or John kept interrupting me, and I'd be really grateful if next time you could keep your eye out for that.
Absolutely. Now, if an organization wanted to start closing the authority gap tomorrow, what's the first practical step that they should take?
Well, apart from having us in to
I was going to say, get in touch with Mary Ann first.
Because it is a long process, I mean, I find I go and give a keynote to start with, just to allow it to become a phrase that is generally used in the organization so people understand it. But it's then, it's pretty much a 6-month process. And the reason it takes so long is that we are trying to overturn habits that have been embedded for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And turning over very embedded lifetime habits takes time, and you can't, one isn't done. If you just go to one workshop, that isn't, or one keynote, that's not going to do it. You've got to have behavioral nudges throughout the process. You've got to have, what we do is we have 3 workshops, each at least a month apart, so that people can make a commitment. They make 3 commitments to do 3 things differently at the end of the first workshop, and they're held to account for that all the way through that succeeding month, in order to try, so they remember to do it. We ask them how they're doing. They tell us whether it's tricky or not. And then they know that at the beginning of the next workshop, they're going to be discussing their commitments and how they went. And then at the end of that one, they make 3 more commitments. And so, you really have to work at it to embed new habits and new behaviors. It's not easy just to tell everybody, oh, we're not going to have an authority gap here anymore. Yeah. But, we also have behavior reminders, like we make these little signs to put in the middle of a meeting table saying, mind the authority gap. So, your eye catches it. Oh, yes, I must remember that. We have little enamel pins that people wear saying the same thing. which are handy because A, they are a conversation starter. People see them and say, oh, what's that? And you start talking about it. B, they're a visual reminder both to you and to the person sitting opposite you to remember it. But also, crucially, particularly if it's a manager or a leader wearing it, what they denote is, please tell me if I contribute to it inadvertently, because we're all going to, we're all going to make mistakes. And I promised not to, I promised to receive your feedback graciously. Yeah.
I can see how that can definitely change the culture of an organization, right? It creates a safe space to call out a behavior that is unconsciously, it's unconscious bias. You attributed it to earlier. This must give you some hope, Mary Ann, working with these organizations, because looking ahead, what other things give you hope that this credibility divide can finally be closed? Do you think it will ever be closed?
Well, I just think the more people know about it, the more they think about it, and the more they practice doing things differently, the more progress we're going to make. I don't think we're going to close it entirely in the world, but, one person at a time. I read an Amazon review of my book where a woman was saying, I put this audio book on in the car on a long drive, and it's been transformational. And my husband now listens to what I say, and he even asks me questions. And I thought, gosh, if I can change the world one husband at a time, I'll be happy. But actually, trying to change it whole organizations at a time is even more transformational. So it can be done. It really can be done if people have the right intentions.
Mary Ann, there was a comment earlier from one of our audience members that said that, this is not something that men do to women specifically. Women, regardless of how you identify in terms of your gender, this is just something humans do, particularly to women. And that's because of unconscious bias by how media, paints women and our credibility. What comment do you have back to that?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I've got a whole chapter in the book called Women Do It Too. And in fact, we always start our training by saying this because we want the men in the room not to feel sort of got at and, blamed and shamed. And we always say, we all do this as human beings. I think men do it more because they're less aware of it. And, because we are often at the wrong end of the authority gap, we're probably a bit more careful, but we still probably find that we listen to men a bit more avidly than we listen to women, that we're going to assume they'll be experts more than we'll assume women will be experts. I always say that we assume a man knows what he's talking about until he proves otherwise, whereas for a woman, it's all too often the other way around. And I think that's true for women as well as men. So, yeah, we all need to check our biases for sure. Even I have bias against women, and I've written a book about it. But at least I notice, or I generally notice, when that bias manifests itself. It's called unconscious for a reason. I'm not doing it on purpose. But when it does, surface in my brain, I'll say to myself, oh, no, that's the bias speaking. And I'll try and reset. So that's what I'd love all of us to do, is just be more aware of our unconscious bias when it manifests itself and then correct for it.
Mary Ann, the time has flown by because I only have 2 more minutes with you. Oh. And I have one more question. Actually, it's 2 parts. So what advice do you have for a woman who is navigating the authority gap currently and doesn't feel that she has supports? And what advice do you have for organizations so that they can take a step in the right direction to address the authority gap?
Well, for women, there must be a colleague that she can talk to about it. I'd really advise her to share her experience. And as I said earlier, if it's happening to her in a group, in a meeting, definitely talk to the person who runs the meeting and draw it to their attention. If this woman has a mentor or a sponsor, it's worth talking about it to them, I would say, and possibly even to her boss. For organizations, get the authority gap known as a phrase so that people can just say in psychological safety in a meeting, oh, I think that was a bit of an authority gap moment. Mm-hmm. Once you feel comfortable saying that, it's quite a useful phrase to use because it's quite neutral. You're talking about the moment, not the person. So you're not sort of, accusing someone or pointing your finger at them, but you're saying, can we just talk about that moment and how we could have handled it better? That will really help to improve things.
Wonderful. Well, Mary Ann, we are at time. Thank you again for joining us to discuss the authority gap. To our audience members, please be sure to pick up Mary Ann's book, The Authority Gap, if you have not already. And also check out her million view tech talk about this very same subject, and follow Mary Ann on LinkedIn. Before we close, we'd like to thank our partner, TENA. This series is made possible through our partnership, and together we're committed to ensuring women are fully seen and supported at every stage of life. Mary Ann, thank you again for joining us for our last LinkedIn Live of the year. We hope to have you back very soon.
Oh, thank you. It's been great.
All right. Take care, everyone.